right, Psalm chapter 6. Let's call this one We Might Suffer at One Speed, but Be Healed at Another, in this chapter, where once again, David is going to offer up a prayer to God, this time that God not deal with him in his hot anger, not focusing so much of the sins of others as his own sins seem to be a part of this prayer. He is going to ask God to be gracious to him. Why? Because he is ultimately going to ask God, how long is he going to have to suffer in his condition? And it does not specify whether his condition is directly related to the sins or the things for which he is calling for mercy, but it seems to describe a prolonged period of suffering, because after he says, how long, Lord, he is going to go on to describe the way in which his tears and his mourning have gone on for a long enough period that he is now exhausted in his grief. But as we noticed in Job, no matter how bad things got, and no matter how much those waves seemed like they had a potential to take Job under, things resurfaced in Job's character. And likewise, once again, David's confidence seems to come back to the surface as he tells his enemies to depart, because he is confident that God has heard his prayer, as he goes on to conclude the chapter by saying in verse 10, all my enemies shall be ashamed and greatly troubled. They shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment. And the two things that probably most caught my attention from David in this chapter were, one, the resilience of his confidence. That's something I just have to admire, because I have to be quite honest that there are many times in which I fail to see a reasonable way out of a bad situation. And in those times, my confidence is actually at its lowest. So I have to admire David here, because I can't step up and say, oh yeah, when things seem quite hopeless, that is when I'm quite sure God's going to answer my prayer. But that's exactly what David is saying here. And more importantly, he is drawing a distinction that we have seen before. And that's the distinction between quickness in terms of time and quickness in terms of speed, because this chapter is making it plain that David is weeping for a prolonged period of time. But not only is he confident that God will hear his prayer, he's confident that his resolution will come quickly, as he describes in the very last phrase, in a moment. And that's a distinction we see over and over again in books like the Revelation, where it talks about the prolonged period of suffering for the saints, but a resolution to their situation that can happen in an instant. And so the thing that further impresses me about David in this situation, like we said, is not only the fact that he seems confident even in a hopeless situation, but for some reason, the relationship he's developed with God over time has brought him to a place where he's confident that God will deliver him quickly. And so my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we have either developed or we are developing the kind of relationship with God that would motivate him to show us mercy and deliver us from even our prolonged suffering quickly.